Hey YouTube. I'm doing something a little different here. This is going to be a pretty nerdy video. Highly technical, even by my standards. If you don't feel like sitting through it, I understand. You see, I've reached a point where on the subjects of religion and evolution, I know enough to know exactly where I stand. Could I learn more? Of course I could. Always. But I've learned enough to know where I stand, and that seems like a good place to put that on hold, while I redirect my efforts to the end of reaching the same point with other subjects. So lately, a couple subjects I've been studying have been economics and finance. Now before I continue, I predict that someone is going to say that money is not everything. I could not agree more. It is, however, a subject we are all well advised to know a few things about. Or would you care to make a case for ignorance? I might also point out that economics is not necessarily about money. It's about scarcity. Economics, at its heart, is the science of how people cope with scarcity. Yes, this includes scarcity in money, but also scarcity in space, time, and supplies, among other things. For example, the space on your desk that your computer takes up is not available to be taken up by anything else. That makes your use of it an economic concern. The time you are spending watching this video is presumably time you could be spending watching some other video. So thank you. I had heard plenty of times that setting prices too low causes shortages, but I never understood how that happens. I had also heard many times that setting them too high causes surpluses, but again I never understood how, or why that was a bad thing. I came to discover that I also had not properly understood the words shortage and surplus in the economic sense instead of the logistical. That is, I didn't understand these until relatively recently. Think of it like this. Most of us have at some point been in a big box retailer. These usually have regular merchandise, seasonal merchandise, and clearance merchandise. The merchandise in the seasonal section is so called because there is a time of the year during which the demand for it is very high, and a time during which the demand for it is very low, effectively non-existent. Shovels are a good example. There is virtually no demand for shovels in the middle of June, at least not in the northern temperate zone. When the demand for seasonal merchandise drops, that is when the merchandise in question goes out of season, any of that merchandise that hasn't sold is drastically marked down, or clearance priced. Why? Because once it's out of season, the demand for it is through the floor, and there's just no way to sell it at its original price. At its original price, it's going to sit there, taking up shelf space, which is an inefficient, uneconomical use of space, which would be better used for something else. So to encourage it to move, they mark it down. So if you want the goods in your inventory to sell faster, you lower the price. If you want them to sell slower, on the other hand, you raise the price. Price and supply are positively correlated, meaning that increases in the one spawn increases in the other. Price and demand, on the other hand, are negatively correlated, meaning that increases in one spawn decreases in the other. Now the idea here is to get the rate at which the goods leave the store to match the rate at which they come into the store. If you set the price too low, they will leave the store faster than they come in, and will have a tendency to run out. That's a bad thing because it's frustrating to your customers who keep coming in to find the good in question out of stock, or in shortage. If, on the other hand, you set the price too high, the good in question will leave much slower than it comes in, resulting in a backlog, or surplus. That's a bad thing, because if it keeps up, you eventually run out of room for all the excess stock, and of course space used to store one item is not available to store others. This is an especially bad thing if the inventory in question is perishable. You definitely don't want that sitting around and backing up. So ideally, retailers have a vested interest in doing what they can to set the price at just the right level so as to keep surpluses and shortages to a minimum. They want to match supply and demand as closely as possible. The closer they can come to a perfect match, which is called market equilibrium, the better. Of course, I don't know that it's possible to maintain a perfect match. It seems to me that it probably shouldn't be. I don't know for certain, but it's surely impossible to avoid the occasional slight fluctuation in demand, but the effort is usually worthwhile. With most goods, the best a retailer can hope for, it seems to me, I could be mistaken, is to keep the price a little on the low side so that shortages are occasional and brief, or a little on the high side and have occasional sales to reduce the surplus. Now this is a problem with price ceilings. If a government imposes direct limitations on how high a company can raise the price of its goods, this can inflate the demand for those goods beyond what supply can possibly hope to meet, resulting in chronic shortages. This is what happened in the US with gasoline when the Nixon administration managed to persuade Congress to help them impose ceilings on gas prices. Initially, this made him very popular enough to be reelected. But it doomed the United States to years of serious gasoline shortages, with people waiting in line for hours for gas that ran out before they reached the pump. This continued until these price ceilings were abolished under the Reagan administration. Additionally, what about cost? Whatever the good or service in question, the company that provides it has to spend a certain amount of money to that end on what are called overhead expenses, the intermediate goods and services that the company in question must buy in order to continue providing its own goods and services. That amount of money is called cost. Each company applies its efforts to the end of providing certain goods and services in the hope of profiting from doing so. One may object to this practice, but whether you approve or not, this is how it is. The only way to generate a profit is to sell those goods and services above cost, to sell them for more than it costs to provide them. What if the given price ceilings keep the price for the good or service in question below cost? That makes the good or service a money-losing venture for the company in question, which gives that company a good reason to stop providing that good or service. So what if the price ceiling is so low that it keeps the price of this good or service below any possible cost? What if it keeps the price of the good or service so low that no one can profit from providing it, that no one can even try to provide it without losing money in the effort? Well, then no one will provide it except perhaps philanthropic organizations which are able to bring these goods and services from locations not under this price ceiling. Setting the price ceiling too low can actually lead to a loss of competition if it doesn't shut down the industry in question altogether. Now what about lower limits on prices? That is, what about price floors? Well, these can foster chronic surpluses the same way. An economy which has price floors and ceilings imposed on most of the goods and services exchanged within it is called a command economy, while an economy in which most of the goods and services exchanged have no such limitations is called a market economy. So if a country wants to keep down the prices of certain goods and services, I recommend a different approach in order to avoid or at least minimize shortages and surpluses, a less direct, more nuanced approach. First, the industry in question must be replete with competition. If there is any difficulty at all for people who don't like the prices they're being charged to find the same good through other sources or other goods that serve the same purpose, steps must be taken to foster competition in the industry. Parties looking to begin competing in this industry should be granted tax cuts and perhaps even initial subsidies to help them get started. Second, it may be that the reason these prices are so high is that cost is so high. If that's the case, the industries that provide the intermediate goods and services that compose cost should likewise be examined to verify and take steps to ensure an abundance of competition which, if not abundant, must be fostered in the same fashion. Third, it may very well be that any given industry that provides essential goods and services has plenty of competition, but still exorbitant prices due to practical limitations. In this case, I recommend government funding of research into ways to provide the most basal raw materials more cheaply, and government funding of the development of alternatives. Indeed, I recommend maintaining this third step under all circumstances. The more cheaply the most essential goods and services can be provided, after all, the greater the percentage of the population who can live above the poverty line. Not necessarily in luxury, but at least out of poverty.